Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 74 of the Stanford MLSys seminar series. This quarter also partnered with CS324, Advances in Foundation Models. Today, I'm joined by Michael and Ivanica. And of course, our guest today is Rob Reich. So Rob is a little bit usual than our typical guest. So he's a professor of philosophy, I believe. He's going to be talking to us a little bit today about professional norms in kind of generative AI. So I think Rob will give a little bit of a spiel, but for this talk today, we think we're gonna want it to be especially interactive. So if you're on YouTube and you have questions, if you have comments, anything, please post those in the chat. If you're in the class, we also have that Discord. So we're really looking forward to a very lively and interesting discussion today. And with that, Rob, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Percy. Thanks, Dan, and the whole rest of the team. It's a pleasure to do this. As Dan already mentioned, I do feel a bit like an odd duck in a class on advanced topics in foundation models. I'm a philosopher by training. I'm going to talk with some slides in just a minute for, probably no more than 30 minutes. Philosophy, for those of you who have taken a class in philosophy before, usually proceeds through dialogue, through questions, answers, and exploration, Socratically in truth-seeking. And as a consequence, perhaps especially appropriate for this particular moment in the world with foundation models and the chat interfaces that have now been developed and all the rage have brought so much attention to the power of these large language models. I would like myself also to be dialogic. In other words, I don't want to give a one-way communication here. My ideas are going to be delivered with some provocation, but I wouldn't wish to attach a great deal of authority to them. Call these provisional ideas about the development of professional norms in generative AI. And I really do want your own questions. I'm going to end my presentation with an open question that can be at least one point of open conversation. So with Dan's permission, please, cast whatever stones you want at me in Discord, lob any question you want that Dan can then provide and interrupt along the way. But I'll get started now with a short presentation. All right. Let me just confirm that you can indeed see the slides. Can Dan, you give a thumbs up there about that?
Yes, looks good
Excellent.
to me.
Okay. So as I said, I'm a philosopher by training. I teach, my home base is in the political science department at Stanford. I'm the current faculty director of the Center for Ethics and Society. I'm also an associate director at the Institute for Human-Centered AI here at Stanford, and I've worked with Percy and others for quite some time at the Center for Research on Foundation Models. So I'm not a complete newbie to the space, but emphasize here, I'm a philosopher, not a technically trained person. I want to provide today overall an argument about why it is so essential to accelerate the development of professional norms in AI in general, but in generative AI in particular. So I want to begin just by giving you a little bit of background. If you had a chance to look at some of the suggested readings, I've done an edited volume on the intersection between digital technology and democratic theory. What are the implications of all of the digital tools and platforms for democratic institutions themselves? And that was an effort to bring together political philosophers who write about democracy along with technologists and social scientists. And then the book on the right is a book that I wrote along with two colleagues here at Stanford. Mehran Sahami, many of you here at Stanford will know. He's the current chair of the computer science department, the longtime instructor of CS 106A, the Introduction to Computer Science class. And Jeremy Weinstein is a colleague of mine in the political science department. He served in the Obama administration at the highest levels of the US government doing policy. And now back at Stanford, it's the three of us together who teach a class called Ethics, Public Policy, and Technology. And that class served as the platform for writing this book that came out just last year. One of the recommended readings for today was the final chapter of the book, which draws upon a whole set of ideas about the importance of developing professional norms alongside the importance of developing actual policy and regulation that emanates from government bodies on questions of AI and ML. So if you want a deeper dive, you can consult either of these texts. So I want to begin in a really broad way. I just want to kind of put on the table the basic idea that it's always been true that scientific revolutions and technological innovation have presented both enormous opportunities to humanity as well as challenges. I would wager that the two most important scientific discoveries or revolutions of the 21st century have taken place in biotechnology and information technology. And that's CRISPR in particular, this extremely powerful gene editing technique developed just within the past decade. And then artificial intelligence, as I've heard other people in this, technical people say, foundation models or large language models are the closest we have to AGI or artificial general intelligence. So the combination of biotechnology and information technology threatens what it is to be human for the simple reason that for the first time we have the technical capacity actually to intervene in evolution itself by editing the human genome in a particular way that's heritable. And similarly, if we create machine intelligence that's on a par with or perhaps superior to human intelligence, that might reorder the way that we think about the place of humanity itself within some broader cosmos. So these are extremely powerful technologies that deserve our attention. The fact that all of you listening today are interested in information technology, AI and ML and foundation models is a good sign. And so I just want to put this in the big possible frame. I'd say at some level, my own thoughts about this are guided by this quote, which I think is worthy of attention. What the inventive genius of mankind has bestowed upon us in the last 100 years could have made human life carefree and happy if the development of the organizing power of man had been able to keep step with his technical advances. But the machine age is as dangerous as a razor in the hands of a 3-year-old child. Or you saw my slide advance there, and this was Albert Einstein in 1932. The basic idea here, of course, is that we have extraordinary scientific and technological advances, especially accelerating in the 20th and 21st centuries, but our institutions meant to try to install basic guardrails for the protection of human interests, and for that matter, the planet's interests, have not accelerated at the same pace. And so in many respects, the machine age is therefore, in Einstein's words, as dangerous as a razor in the hands of a 3-year-old child. He, of course, said this at the dawning age of the nuclear weapon and nuclear technology, nuclear energy, extraordinary potential social benefits, extraordinary potential social harms. I'd say the same is true these days about gene editing and about AI and ML. So there's Einstein in 1932. You might have seen this quote as well. E.O. Wilson, a biologist at Harvard, often this is quoted in various ways to try to summarize the excitement and also danger of the moment. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. It's terrifically dangerous. It's now approaching a point of crisis overall. Again, the idea is that our human emotional state is not evolving, is not keeping pace with technology. Our institutions are rooted in several centuries in the past, and yet technology and science advances to a godlike state. So what I want to suggest here is a familiar observation for anybody who studied this, which is that there's an enormous gap between tech innovation and wise policy and regulation. On the frontier, technology almost always races ahead of the possibility of policy and regulation to keep up with it. Now, some of this is inevitable, and that's just a function of where the frontier is and the impossibility that people sitting in, either Washington, D.C. or any other, government in the world aren't in the research lab understanding the fine-grained details of what now technically is possible. But some of it is also a matter of the general orientation that many technologists have toward government itself. So let me just say a few words about this. Jeremy and Maren and I wrote an article entitled "Democracy is Losing Its Race with Disruption," the idea that the disruptive technologies of this century are challenging government and regulation in ways that we haven't seen in the past. and that we have to try as best we can to get our policymakers educated in a way that they can keep up with the pace of change. Some of this, however, is our own fault. So you all probably recognize this figure. This is US President Ronald Reagan, president in the 1980s. Reagan sort of inaugurated or brought about a general distrust of government, especially here in California. Reagan, of course, was the governor of California before he went off to become the president of the United States. If you need a way to kind of think about Reagan's orientation, inaugurating the conservative kind of revolution in Washington that is still in many respects with us today, he said that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, you may remember this, maybe not if you haven't studied American history. His answer to this question is the following: I'm from the government and I'm here to help. If for a political scientist there were ever some more depressing words to be uttered, I would be hard pressed to identify them. Don't look for the government to do things and get things done. The best government is the government that governs least and stays out of the way. If that sounds like a familiar orientation for the techno-libertarian oriented founders and venture capitalists of the Bay Area, you can trace some of that back to Ronald Reagan. Our current era in technology really wasn't a product of Reagan's time, the 1980s, but instead was the product of some Democrats in office. That's Bill Clinton and Al Gore. Of course, Vice President Al Gore, allegedly the person who invented the internet itself. Al Gore was early in identifying the significance of the internet and the implications for American geopolitical standing. He insisted, Al Gore did, on paving the information superhighway in the United States so that the United States would be well positioned to win that race. And so in order to try to provide every possible incentive for Silicon Valley in particular to be at the forefront of the development of the internet, the Clinton-Gore administration left what they called a regulatory oasis around tech companies. They tried to make as minimal the number of regulations possible. And that's, of course, best summed up in something we know about today, CDA 230, the Communications Decency Act, which is a part of the broader Telecommunications Act of 1996, which established a liability shield for any telecommunications provider, an internet provider that posted content that it did not generate on the internet itself. So, of course, the reason why Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, etc., don't bear any responsibility, no legal liability for content that's posted, is because of this regulatory oasis that's been crafted, and many people think is the reason that allowed the internet to develop commercially in the way that it did. Now, I want to then think about in an environment in which there are very few ways of thinking about regulation catching up to the technological frontier. It's all the more important, I want to suggest, that we lean on professional norms. So you might expect a political philosopher to come in and talk about how important policy and regulation is, and I'll have various things to say about that in the things I've written. But here I really want to emphasize how important professional norms are. And to get a sense of this, I'll just invite you to compare the state of affairs of professional norms or standards of responsible conduct in biomedical research as compared to AI and ML research. And I'll cut to the chase here. What I want to say, perhaps with some deliberate provocation, is that computer scientists, AI and ML researchers are in a state of developmental immaturity. They have not developed the kind of robust professional norms that exist in many other fields, in part because AI and ML is a relatively young field. And so it seems difficult to imagine developing professional norms, in part because there are so few roots to them at the moment. Let's do a quick comparison. Let's think about biomedical ethics as compared to computing or AI and ML ethics. In biomedical ethics, of course, you go back centuries, even millennia, to think about the Hippocratic Oath, a basic orientation. Medical students everywhere, when they graduate, participate in a ceremony in which they take the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. There's professional licensure requirements for healthcare providers. If a doctor or a nurse or some other healthcare provider fails to perform up to accepted standards of the delivery of medical care, they can lose their license to provide it, and they're no longer able then to do the job they had in healthcare. In anyone in a university setting, in a pharmaceutical setting, a drug company setting, that wants to do research that involves human subjects, you have to pass your research proposal through an institutional review board that contains an ethics review designed to protect the interests of human subjects. There's, of course, a central regulatory body in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, that has to authorize the release of any drug. And then there is a well-developed institutional footprint in universities and hospitals. Bioethics is an entire scholarly field, ethics committees at hospitals. What do we find equivalently or analogously in computing or in AI and ML? Well, the ACM does indeed have a code of ethics. Many people are members of the ACM. That's the professional body. Not many people, in my experience, are aware that the ACM has a code of ethics, and they're unaware of whether there's an enforcement mechanism for them. There's no equivalent of an IRB for data scientists or AI and ML researchers. You can just use the data you want in any way you want. You don't need to pass it through an institutional review board. You just get to work. And of course, there's no single regulatory body and no well-developed institutional footprint in universities or hospitals. There's a growing field you might call AI ethics as a scholarly field, but it's in its infancy, and it's not common to have ethics committees within companies or within computer science departments or schools of engineering. So, as I say, AI and ML ethics is developmentally immature, at least as compared to biomedical ethics. Now, let's think of this less as an abstract matter and more as a concrete matter. I want to characterize this as carbon ethics versus silicon ethics. Ethics as concerns human beings, and ethics as concerns computing chips. In carbon ethics, we think about human beings as patients. We think about them as subjects of care, and we take a Hippocratic oath to try to pledge ourselves to doing no harm. In silicon ethics, we think of human beings as users. We think of them as objects of prediction, and there is no such thing as the Hippocratic oath. Again, compare and contrast the orientation in bioethics as compared to AI ethics. How did biomedical, the field, develop professional norms? Well, the Hippocratic oath, as I said, goes back millennia. You could actually learn about and read about how it is that professional norms develop. You could study this as a social scientist. You could study this not just as a matter of abstract philosophy in the way that I'm approaching it now, but go back historically to the evolution. There's something called the Flexner Report, which was carried out in 1910 by a philanthropist that funded it, that was designed to try to take stock of the fact that there was unbelievable quackery in the medical field. People selling all kinds of wild drugs on the market without any regulation of any kind, a kind of orientation to medical education in which there were very few standards that governed how it is that medical providers were trained. So the Flexner Report came out and established extraordinary numbers of standards in medical education and made either dubious or in some cases illegal the idea of doing a drug development in your garage with a whole bunch of natural, oils or concoctions or herbs or whatever it turns out to be, that you could then claim whatever you wanted on their behalf. More perhaps importantly, after World War II and the Nazi era experiments on humans who were kept in the concentration camps, there was an effort in the Nuremberg Code to install official protections for human subjects. Medical experimentation could only take place when there were forms of consent, and there had to be obvious benefits for people who were subject to experimental treatments. That in the United States was formalized in the Belmont Report in 1979, in which official informed consent was required. You couldn't deceive medical patients about whether they were receiving various forms of treatment. They had to consent to the various experimental treatments they were receiving. Now, you might think that so we need calamities in order to develop professional norms. Nuremberg and World War II, Nazi-era experiments as a global disaster. I want to think that within artificial intelligence, ML, foundation models in particular, we shouldn't need calamity, global catastrophe in order to develop professional norms. And that's part of why the talk I'm giving today is designed to try to accelerate the development of those in the absence of having catastrophe confront us. All right, here's a local way of thinking about this. You might recognize a couple people there on the right-hand side. That's Fei Li here on campus, the computer vision pioneer, professor in the computer science department and co-director of the Institute for Human-Centered AI. On the left is Russ Altman, who's a professor here at Stanford as well. He's also an associate director of the Institute for Human-Centered AI. In the middle is a University of California professor named Jennifer Doudna. Jennifer Doudna is one of the co-discoverers of the Crispr gene editing technique. She won the Nobel Prize just a few years ago for that discovery. This was a conversation about professional ethics that took place at Stanford just before the pandemic hit in 2019. And thinking about the difference between biomedical research that Jennifer Doudna represents and AI and ML research that Fei-Fei Li represents, here's a story that is important to share about the contrast between the Jennifer Doudnas of the world and the AI ML people of the world. Jennifer Doudna had a dream shortly after she discovered CRISPR in her laboratory. This is a passage from her memoir called A Crack in Creation. You can read Walter Isaacson's biography about her called Codebreaker. In her dream, she said, I followed my colleague into a room to meet a person, and Hitler appeared to her in the dream. He had a pig face, perhaps because I'd spent so much time thinking about the humanized pig genome that was being rewritten with CRISPR around this time. Hitler was meticulously prepared for our meeting with pen and paper, ready to take notes, and fixing his eyes on me with keen interest, Hitler said, I want to understand the uses and implications of this amazing technology you've developed. In Doudna's own telling, she woke up in a cold sweat from this nightmare in which Hitler declared his interest in using CRISPR, of course, for his purposes. And she did the following. In the next week, she assembled some of the top researchers in gene editing across the world. They had a bunch of meetings in order to try to talk about the potential negative implications of CRISPR for humanity itself. And they published a paper that established what they called a prudent path forward for genomic engineering and germline gene modification, as was signed by many of the top people in the field, the top researchers in the field, in which they had a voluntary moratorium on using CRISPR on human embryos or on human beings. It was not law. It was not policy. It wasn't created by government. It was just created by the top status, the high status researchers in the field. And that moratorium on banning the use of CRISPR in human beings held for a couple of years until a biomedical researcher actually did use CRISPR on some human embryos. He had been a postdoc here at Stanford. He eventually was put in prison in China. Stanford cleared the postdoctoral lab, the lab where he had spent some time as a postdoctoral fellow for having used CRISPR on human beings. The important thing I want to emphasize here is what happened to him. Leaving aside the fact that China put him in prison, every professional conference at which biomedical researchers appear would not allow him to present his papers. No journal would publish anything he'd written, and he suffered significant professional costs for having violated this voluntary ban on using CRISPR on human embryos. Can you think of any equivalent thing happening in the state of AI and ML? Can you think of anyone who has not broken the law, but has faced professional consequences, professional stigma for doing something against the general norms of what AI ML researchers expect as the standard of responsible conduct? Now, I have this slide up because what I want to suggest here is at the moment in the state of the field, what we have are company-specific declarations of norms. So Microsoft, for example, decided that it would not sell its facial recognition technologies following similar moves by Amazon and IBM. And you can find on Microsoft, on Amazon and IBM, well-developed statements of AI ethics, well-developed statements about policies that govern the use inside the company of the development of powerful tools like facial recognition. However, since these are not community-wide policies, you can also find companies that develop facial recognition technology and are very happy to sell it to anyone who wants to buy it. There's a company that all of you probably know of called Clearview AI. Here's the founder of Clearview AI in an initial interview in the New York Times in which people asked about the potential terrible implications of having on-demand facial recognition for everyone on their smartphone on the street. Asked about the implications, the founder said, I have to think about that. Our belief is that this is the best use of the technology. And Clearview AI has gone on to happily sell its facial recognition tools to police departments, allowing them to use these tools in any manner they see fit. Those have been used in Black Lives Matter protests, Clearview AI being the provider of them. So here is an example about what happens when you get company-specific standards, but no community-wide standards. Company-specific standards means if you work at Amazon, Microsoft, or IBM, you feel good about yourself because you have good policies in place, good ethics and policy standards in place for the facial recognition tools. But Clearview AI is happy to do it and suffers no consequences for doing it. In fact, of course, makes money from occupying that place in the market. And society is in the same bad place it would have been if no one had the standards at all. What I want to suggest is that in AI and ML and foundation models, especially at this moment, we need to try to develop industry-wide, community-wide standards, not company-specific standards. You might like the standards of any particular place, OpenAI, Anthropic, Hugging Face, you pick your favorite place. I, at some basic level, am not so interested in attaching a gold star to any particular company. I want to see how it is we can develop community-wide standards and norms. So as an example, I invite you to think about what I view as the lack of such standards and what happens. You get various people who develop, here various forms of facial recognition or computer vision to do automated inference on criminality using facial images, which face prints, which is, in my view, nothing too distant from 21st century phrenology and racism, trying to predict criminality on the basis of nothing more than a face print. That deserves, in my mind, community stigma attached to the authors who do such work. And you could find other examples of this. This is just the one that I happen to pick out. More perhaps importantly, what happens when an engineer breaks the ACM code of ethics? Well, they lose membership in the ACM. That's the only remedial action available. To the best of my knowledge, no one has suffered reputational costs for violating the code of ethics, and so there's no enforcement mechanism that does any work here. Professional stigma doesn't really attach to people who violate community norms. So we go back to this comparison between biomedical ethics and the professional norms there, and in AI or ML. You have all of these well-developed professional norms within the biomedical research community and nothing quite the same within AI, ML ethics. And so I view that as a real problem. And so hence the title of this presentation, How to Accelerate the Development of Professional Norms Within the Foundation Model Community. I'll mention a few steps forward. I'm going to talk just a little bit about something called the Ethics and Society Review. I'm going to talk about potential regulation by the FTC, that's antitrust approaches, and ethics education in computer science as a minor thing. Okay, let's go to the next thing. I've written, along with some other people, the idea that AI developers need to develop a code of responsible conduct. This is a blog post from last year in my philosophical provocation, that the AI profession is like a late-stage teenager. They're newly aware of all their great powers in the world, but the frontal cortex is still somewhat undeveloped, and so they don't exercise much social responsibility. I'd like to accelerate the AI ML profession into its mid-20s or late 20s rather than being 19-year-olds and being socially irresponsible. That's the provocation to offer you. I hope in the Discord you're beginning to cast your stones at me. Dan, if you've got some good objections, I want to hear them. I tried to ask GPT. There's a whole bunch of things. All right, I'll stop here and then we'll take some questions. I asked ChatGPT or GPT-3 whether AI should have professional norms. I thought a classic dodge of an answer, difficult question. There is no easy answer. That's true, and I will grant the language model that there's no attempt to deliver an answer was also in some respects telling. All right, Dan, over to you, and let's take a question or two or a comment or two.
Yeah, so there has been a lively discussion in the Discord. So thank you to all the students for that discussion. I think there's been kind of, if I were to summarize, two sets of reactions.
Yeah.
So there's one set of reaction, I'm sure you've heard these from, in various flavors, is I'll summarize the question as one difference between kind of the biomedical field and ML or AI is in some sense the impact, the distance from impact from somebody's behavior in biomedicine is a lot shorter to be able to have a negative impact on somebody compared to ML or AI. So the example that somebody in the class gave is if a surgeon shows up to a surgery drunk, then bad things can happen immediately in the operating theater. Whereas the argument is in ML or AI, the path towards somebody developing something, then it eventually being used something negative happening seems to be a lot shorter.
Sure.
So do you have thoughts on kind of that difference between the two fields?
Good. Let's take that first. I think it's an important observation. I guess I'd say first just about the premise of the question or the objection is that while I think it's sometimes true that there's a shorter distance, and the surgery example, the surgeon who shows up drunk, is a good one to illustrate that indeed sort of immediate and direct harm. And so the actions necessary to try to prevent that are important. But there are other kinds of basic drug discovery. I mean, if you work in an R&D lab in a pharmaceutical company, you are indeed quite distant from the human beings who might possibly be harmed, especially if you're just in the genuine basic research phase rather than a drug trial phase. So I think there are other ways in which still biomedical research is like AI and ML research, and that the basic research is still quite distant. And yet the biomedical researchers know that they have internalized a variety of norms that put at the center of their considerations the integrity of a human subject, and a whole set of well-developed rules to try to protect human subjects, even if it's much more downstream from the work they're doing. But the more general and important point, conceding the importance of this observation from the folks on Discord, is that I'm not trying to suggest here that AI and ML simply take the biomedical world as an example and just do the same as whatever happens in the biomedical field. I'm trying to show that AI and ML is developmentally immature and needs to develop its own purpose-built types of norms and standards. It shouldn't learn and just port over from the biomedical world the same kinds of institutions and norms that govern biomedical research. It should develop its own purpose-built set of norms in order to make it an institutional footprint of these norms that are purpose-built for the different kinds of ways in which AI and ML work. So in that respect, I fully agree with the comment, but I don't think that turns out to be, as it were, an objection to the idea that such norms should exist. It's just that they shouldn't be ported over from the biomedical world. They should be tailor-built for the different circumstances of AI and ML. Do you have another one, Dan, or should I keep going?
I think I'll put one more in there that you may have some thoughts or slides on later that the Discord is very interested in asking. So some folks in the Discord are worried about some sort of like environmental responsibility or some economic responsibility, where people who break the rules are kind of rewarded economically, and it's hard to enforce norms. So there seems to be this very stark difference between you can break the rules and get a bunch of press, Twitter, etc., and having some sort of, I guess, enforcement action or something to make it so that it's not
right. Good. I'll come back to that. I think that's another correct observation in my experience. I'm taking that not as a happy state of affairs, but a problem to solve. And so I'll have a couple of suggestions about that. Okay, let me just add and get to the end of the short presentation here. If you think back to OpenAI and the release of GPT-2, as you all know, there was no even wider sharing of the basic model beneath it. There was the policy team overrode the technical team at OpenAI back in 2019, wouldn't release the model for testing in any way. Later on, they changed their release strategy and began with this restricted release and then began to open up. Of course, now OpenAI is charting a somewhat different path given the way that they've moved from being a research lab to a commercial lab. And that's the moment we're in. I mean, so as I've been hanging out over the course of the past couple of months in CRFM, I've heard various people come in and say, the days of a research lab orientation are over, and now it's a commercial lab. The commercial dynamics is kicking in. Dear students, go work in a startup rather than a research lab, because all the interesting questions are going to be at the interface of the development of these models and some commercial application of them. Now, in that scenario, all the concerns that I've just been describing of professional norms are going to be even more important, because the commercial dynamic will put trust and safety, various social considerations in the back seat rather than in the front seat in the research lab orientation. And we get a dynamic like this. This is back to the kind of commercial dynamic, here's the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman: the social response of business is to increase its profits, not to take social responsibility into the company form itself. John Doerr, once the VCs get involved, the VC-backed technology companies have created the greatest legal creation of wealth this planet has ever seen. The unbelievable hype right now about investing in foundation model companies, or the companies that are using these AI and ML tools, leading to a kind of moment of it's a new platform play, a new way to establish a kind of dominance which could displace Google or other places, means that as the venture capitalists arrive on the scene, the coin of the realm, in addition to being money, is going to be speed of deployment. Get to the marketplace and scale quickly. That's going to be, in general, bad news unless we have professional norms that can still insist upon the safety considerations that have animated places like OpenAI, Anthropic, and others. So I'll close just by saying what can be done. I don't want to just point out problems. Philosophers can sometimes be criticized justly, in my view, for saying they provided a way to admire how hard the problem is, but they've offered no solutions of any kind. And so instead, I want to just close with a couple suggestions about solutions and then a question for you at the end. All right. What count as community norms within the space of AI and ML? Well, benchmarking is a community norm. That's not enforced through the law. Benchmarking can be a way of organizing the basic practice of the development of models. And of course, here at CRFM, Helm, a holistic evaluation of language models, is one way of trying to orient people towards various forms of socio-technical benchmarks in addition to technical benchmarks to try to steer the development of the field. I'd like to see additional ways that benchmarking takes place in a way that takes account of some of the ethical and social considerations that are often discussed quite openly within the companies that are developing these powerful models. Think about an ethical review process rather than an IRB, an independent board to decide upon release, and some other things about auditing LLMs. Let me give you a couple examples there. So there's the Helm paper from the CRFM group just in the past year. For those of you here at Stanford, you may be familiar with it already. I think there's something in the neighborhood of 30 different models that have been tested now on the Helm benchmark, and I think that's a good dynamic. If we can invest more time and attention in developing really good benchmarks that are widely adopted and used by the broader industry community, that would be a good way to try to orient community norms. There is an expectation that any model that gets released or used in a commercial deployment perform well on a set of widely agreed upon benchmarks. Next, ethical review. Well, here's the page from NeurIPS. For many of you who have presented at NeurIPS, you know that there's an ethical review that's attached to a NeurIP proposal and in order to get into the conference. There's a variety of problems in my view with the NeurIPS ethical review, but in general, this is a really good first step. I'd say these are some early baby steps towards trying to get something like an institutional review board around AI and ML work. Another effort here at Stanford, an ethics and society review as a precondition for funding. Any proposal is asked to submit a kind of ethics and society review about the potential wider implications of the research or the AI ML project that's being developed. These types of things are good developments, and if they're more widely adopted in industry as well within universities, I would view that as a positive step. Percy and a variety of us, Rishi Bomanisi, along with Kathy Creel and myself, wrote a piece just a little less than a year ago about developing some community standards for when foundation models should be released rather than a default orientation to open access. This had in it a proposal for establishing an independent board populated by people from industry as well as academia that would decide upon or give guidance to any company about whether a model should be provided in an open access way. You can read the paper to get more details there. Just yesterday, perhaps one of the people most expert in the world on these types of considerations about release, Irene Soliman from Hugging Face, released this paper, a really systematic review of powerful generative AI systems and a framework for establishing levels of access to them. I'll invite you to read the paper. As I say, I think it just was posted yesterday. She was earlier at OpenAI and participated in some of the decision-making there around GPT-2 and GPT-3. So that's the end of the slideshow. What I want to end with then is something about this question of open access. My own view is that whereas in the research lab orientation, when OpenAI was moving as the kind of first mover in the field, what brought many of these things to wider public attention, there was an emphasis on safety and an emphasis on various social considerations driven by effective altruist considerations about value alignment as well. But the arrival of stability AI in particular, in my view, seems to have shifted the dynamic in the field in which open access is more and more the norm. The idea that a kind of open access models are built some number of months or maybe a short amount of time after a closed model has been designed and deployed is also a dynamic here as well. I don't know how to think about open access, open source at the moment. And so I would be especially keen in the Discord to get your own views about this. Some people criticized OpenAI with GPT-2 when it closed access by saying, sure, well, I'm developing super powerful things in my lab as well, and I'm not going to tell you about them because they're too powerful to release publicly. And it was a sort of criticism that in the spirit of open science, of open research, that is the way that most science is conducted. OpenAI's move here was a kind of publicity, a PR move to try to call attention to itself. On the other side, as we hear more and more people say, especially from within the companies themselves, if only you could see the power of the models that we haven't even released yet or haven't even talked about widely, you'd be really concerned too about the social benefits that are possible, as well as some of the social costs or concerns that might be raised by these. And when I hear people talk about how powerful some of these models are, raising a whole host of new concerns, then I also think about the following. Would you want, for example, nuclear fissile material to be open sourced? Let's democratize nuclear fission. Let everyone play with some plutonium and uranium because that will accelerate the development of nuclear energy. That sounds like a disaster, and we're fortunate that plutonium and uranium are scarce in the world and can be tightly regulated. In the world of biotechnology, would you want there to be an open source access to the smallpox genome, in which we said to people, let's let everyone play with smallpox and see what else is possible? Again, another disaster that would be waiting. There should be no default orientation to democratizing AI or having open access unless we're confident that we have contained some of the risks involved. And so I'm not sure myself how to think about open source and open access in this particular moment. If foundation models are as powerful and significant as people say they are from inside the companies, then having an open source orientation to them seems to me possibly akin to saying, let's open source smallpox, let's open source nuclear fission. Now, maybe that's overblown, maybe that's super dramatic. I'm not sure, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts about this. Thanks for the chance to present, Dan.
Thank you, Rob. That was a really interesting conversation. So I think that YouTube is on a slight delay, so I'll let the Discord and the YouTube chat catch up to the last question about open source versus closed source. So if you have thoughts about that, I saw one person commented already, thank God infectious diseases are not open source.
Right.
But yes, while we wait for those, I did see one comment in the YouTube chat, I think related to this. So here the question was phrased in terms of regulatory capture. And I think what the YouTube chat comment is asking about is there are some regulations that can, if you may be designed by private interest or something like that, where they would incentivize or be designed to kind of help the private interests or large companies. So one example could be, let's say GPT-4 or whatever is some magical thing that could revolutionize the economy, and whoever has access to it can basically start printing free money. Yeah. Then a company like OpenAI would have a strong incentive to say, oh, this is too dangerous for everybody else. We're the only ones who can use it. And then they would just turn on their free money printer. So how do you think about kind of those incentives in terms of who gets to write the regulations and the norms?
Excellent point. And I have something substantive to say about it, but I want to observe first that that's a familiar phenomenon in any industry. The companies that are doing the best in the market often spend significant money to try to lobby and engage in regulatory capture. So this isn't special to the tech field. This is, in fact, well known and widely discussed in lots of different places. So there are a whole variety of ways of thinking about reforms that would try to minimize this, from campaign finance reform to lobbying reform, et cetera, et cetera. And I would have a whole variety of things to say in favor of those type of reforms. But in the absence of them, then we have to think about some of the risks that are posed about whether the large players with their money printing machines, if that's the dynamic that involves, would have an outsized say in developing regulations. But that strikes me as yet another reason to try to accelerate the development of professional standards and norms within the community now. If we can get the potentially large players now, like OpenAI, signed up to some community-wide expectations, then what we're doing is trying to ensure that people are playing on a level playing field, so to speak, with some guardrails in place more generally that do not depend upon government stepping in. Let me give another concrete example of this, because if you're having trouble imagining where has this ever happened, it's like feels like magic that communities just self-regulate. Here's a concrete example. Back about 70 years ago, with the novel technology of movies and the showing of movies in theaters, lots of people could go see them. Movie industry made tons and tons of movies and released them every year. And there were concerns that many people had about 6 and 7-year-olds going to see movies where the content was not appropriate for their age. Various potential legislation was proposed to try to restrict the way that companies made movies, movie studios made movies. And instead of submitting to government regulation, what happened was that the industry players got together and created the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, which devised a ratings guide for movies, the familiar thing of the G, the PG, the PG-13, and the R. That's not a matter of law. That's not a matter of any particular movie studio. Anytime a studio developed a film, made a film, it sent it to this independent ratings board for a rating. And then movie theaters would only show movies that had been rated in this respect. Again, an industry-wide standard. It wasn't a particular company that did this. It was something that companies bought into and established their own representation on in order to provide basic guidelines, basic guardrails for the very product they were developing. That, again, provides a kind of analogy for the sort of thing that could happen within this relatively small space of foundation model development now.
So I think one question there would be, what is it about kind of the movie industry that made it so that it was possible to kind of self-regulate in this way? I think somebody just posted a great question about it. So suppose one organization refuses to follow any norms. Isn't there a game theoretic argument that anybody else who is kind of putting themselves under some norms would be putting themselves at a disadvantage?
Yes, which is why some type of teeth for these norms, if they're violated, is important. Think back to the Chinese biomedical researcher I mentioned earlier, who used CRISPR against the community norms more generally, not to use it on humans. He suffered professional costs that were not imposed by the rule of law in governments, but were imposed by the community. Disinvited from every professional conference, no journal would publish his papers, wouldn't be hired at a pharmaceutical company. If you can impose costs, stigma, if you want to put it this way, on people who violate the norms, then it's possible actually to have a self-reinforcing equilibrium in which the idea of losing, of being the chump by adopting norms, instead becomes a practice which is self-reinforcing. But the high status players have to be willing to impose costs on norm violators in these circumstances.
So I think one other strain of questions that was coming up in the Discord chat quite a bit related to this set of questions is, I think, so a lot of these properties that we're noticing where, ranking norms has some economic or incentive or otherwise, seems to apply to a lot of different industries. So in one question, they brought up environmental pollution, large financial institutions, the military industrial complex.
Yep.
These seem to be problems in society in general.
Right.
So then the question is, if we don't have solutions for those fields, what hope does AI have?
Fair. One standard way to think about a fundamental goal of regulation is to try to get industry actors to internalize the costs of negative externalities. That's the classic argument about, say, chemical pollution in rivers. There's an economic incentive just to pass your effluent into the stream rather than to pay the costs of containing it. Every company has the incentive to do this in order to save money. If there's no regulation that establishes a way to internalize the costs across industry, there's a broader collective action problem for getting to a better equilibrium. And yes, so that goes all the way back to the very beginning of the presentation, which is that professional norms are not a substitute for policy and regulation. Eventually, policy and regulation does have to arrive on the scene for these basic functions of internalizing negative externalities. But in an era in which we shouldn't expect in the near term wise policy and regulation to arrive, it's on us, as it were, to have standards that are industry-wide, community-wide, rather than just in our own heads.
So another question related to this, I think, kind of bouncing off these conversations is, so how does one start imposing cost or stigma on Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, Meta? One person gave an example of Google recently who's been talking about being responsible with the release of their models. And in the meantime, OpenAI and Microsoft says, okay, while you're doing that, we're going to take search from you. So yep. How do you go about imposing costs like that?
Well, I mean, here's where I hope the community that's listening now would have ideas. I myself have, spent time within HAI and the AI ML community for 4 or 5 years, and so I have some I call them provisional ideas in this respect. I'd be especially keen to hear from other people with much more experience. I'll use the Jennifer Doudna example as a potential answer or model, which is that Jennifer Doudna has this nightmare in which Hitler appears, and she decides that she wants to do something against her own commercial interests, against, in certain respects, her own personal interests, insofar as it's going to require a lot of time from her. And she organizes the highest status people in the field to try to identify the lowest common denominator norm that everyone can agree upon. And that's no one should use CRISPR yet on humans or human embryos. And they publish this paper announcing it. So analogously here, perhaps the highest status people in the AI and ML community can get together, try to identify some common lowest common denominator about what people shouldn't do with these models or how people shouldn't train the models, like pick your intervention point. And when and if people violate those norms, there's a generally understood cost to be paid, which is that, no one hires the person, or you can't present at NeurIPS or at any conference. Archive won't accept your paper. Like you figure out what the relevant cost is. But in this respect, it's not especially rocket science to imagine this. It's just the problem is identifying what the norms are and then finding mechanisms to kick into action the enforcement of them.
I want to jump over to kind of a different strain of questions that we've been kind of seeing in the Discord. So I think the conversation for the past few minutes has been around kind of how do you enforce norms and how do you kind of do that economically? I think there's another set of questions around, let's say, kind of skepticism about whether somebody or any one body of people could be kind of the right people to enforce or create norms. So there's a couple of questions like, who are the people that would enforce these standards? How do we determine who the stakeholders are?
Yeah.
And things like that. And I think one person brought up a great example that somebody trained one of these models on 4chan, GPT 4chan, and then there was a strongly worded letter from the NLP community, I think led by Percy and a couple of people in CRFM. So I think there's also this strain of thought in a little bit in Discord, also kind of out there on Twitter about this kind of very techno-libertarian view of why
Sure.
should anybody,
Yeah.
even should there be regulation?
Good. I mean, excellent question, and an absolutely essential and important question. And what I want to say about this is one of the most important questions in political theory and political philosophy. What makes for a legitimate community representative, or who are the guardians meant to try to police our collective behavior, and who guards the guardians? Why should we trust that they're going to act well? This is what political philosophy has devoted itself to trying to give answers to over the course of time. And there are many well-developed ways of handling that type of question. How do you establish legitimacy? How do you provide countervailing sources of power so that power isn't concentrated in the hands of just one person or one body? How do you find ways of democratically authorizing the people and identifying the relevant stakeholders so that there's some sense of legitimate standing to enforce these norms? All garden variety questions with a whole set of institutional designs and answers from within the realm of political philosophy. So for anyone with that question on their mind, I invite you to come take a class in political philosophy because we're going to have lots of solutions for you.
Right. I think we're starting to see another set of questions come up in the Discord chat. So even going beyond kind of industrial professional norms. So how do you start thinking about norms when nation states kind of have governments and nation states have incentives? So there's one question about how do you think about enforcing AI community standards across countries and not just US-based tech communities? What if other countries don't follow those standards? I think somebody posted an article about the AI war between China and the US.
Yep.
So how do you start thinking about these things when governments may start thinking about it in terms of like national security implications?
Yeah, this is not an if governments do this, but they are doing this. Geopolitical considerations have entered the space here. The AI arms race, if that's what we want to call it, between the United States and China is just one manifestation of this. Another is the kind of familiar phrase we hear, America innovates and Europe regulates. Europe's added value to the technology is GDPR, the Digital Services Act, and other things to try to provide a regulatory approach to thinking about this. There's nothing I have that's sort of interesting to say about this other than, well, this is what it is to think about international relations now. I invited you before to think about political philosophy and democratic theory, and now we can think about IR, international relations, as a way of understanding, predicting, and providing a broader set of norms for thinking about global affairs themselves. Like the United Nations is one such mechanism and design. Now, am I recommending that for these questions on the frontier of technology about foundation models, we look to the UN? No, I am not recommending that. As a player in geopolitics, the UN is nevertheless relevant. So are there all kinds of problems when it comes to geopolitics and norms that actually do work across many different countries? Yes, there are. And that's, again, a familiar problem for anyone who studies international relations. And there are a variety of answers available that begin with things like trying to find various ways of establishing treaties, trying to think about the idea of human rights and the human rights as a benchmark against which we test various AI and ML models. The oversight board for Meta, for example, takes a kind of human rights law approach to thinking about the decisions that the oversight board makes. That's one way of thinking about these geopolitical concerns that arise in cases, especially with multinational corporations and countries' very self-interest at stake.
Cool. Thank you so much. So we're approaching 4:30. So I want to come back a bit closer to home with one last question to kind of close out the discussion. The question comes from someone in the class who says Stanford as a research community is responsible for a lot of the rapid progress in AI and ML. So are there concrete suggestions if we kind of move closer to home for what we can do kind of at Stanford to build safety culture and ethical norms kind of here at our home institution?
Great question. And at some level, that's what I feel that HAI is trying to carry out, to integrate into the training of technologists, various social science and ethics perspectives, so that you don't outsource your ethical questions. The idea is you bring in the ethics expert. Like sometimes I say, it would be a disaster if the way to approach this problem was that every company should appoint a CEO, the chief ethics officer. An ethical question arises, you punt it to the chief ethics officer. No, ethics has to be something that we all take part in. The community norms are really important here. Developing the benchmarks, the Helm project is one example of that. Finding ways in which the coursework at Stanford can be something that incorporates into the training of people with technical skills a variety of game theoretic, geopolitical, ethical, philosophical frameworks. That's just one way to begin. And then I guess in more generally, I'd say, how can we bring about a cultural shift on campus so that the aspiration that an 18-year-old has or a 21-year-old has to acquire these extraordinary technical skills that you can get at Stanford can't be fulfilled without also getting some ethical frameworks, some social science, some policy considerations at the same time. Stanford's human capital pipeline should make it impossible to graduate here without a fundamental encounter with ethics and social considerations about the very technical skills and things that are now possible in AI and ML.
Great. Well, I think that's a great note to end it on. We're at 4:30, so yep. I think we'll call it for this. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. It was a very interesting talk. We had a very lively discussion in the Discord, and definitely not the typical thing that we see here. So very, very grateful that for your time today.
I'm grateful for the invitation. Thanks for having me.
So moving on to a little bit of logistics. So next week, we're going to have Nicholas Carlini from Google Brain. So everybody can please tune into that. If you're interested in reading more about the schedule and learning more about the seminar, you can go to mlsys.stanford.edu to look at our schedule. We also have a mailing list where we send like 2 emails a week with just whoever is speaking that week. Yeah, so if you're interested, you can go to the website to look at that. And with that, we will say goodbye to YouTube and goodbye to everybody who's been watching. Thank you so much to the audience for tuning in today. And thank you again for Rob for a really great talk.